Ladies and gentlemen, let's start listening to our first speaker from Istanbul, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, in his 15-minute presentation about the strategic dimension of the Israeli nuclear arsenal. Please go ahead, sir. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I would like to thank my brethren in Al-Raisouni Forum for scholarly discussion, for this very important discussion and topics for the Arab audience and viewers, particularly the elites, who must understand the magnitude and the risks involved in trying to talk about this issue from 10 main topics very briefly. First, the essence of Zionism and its entity. Zionism as an ideology, a movement, and a state is a colonial replacing entity or system that can only not only needs to replace the indigenous population, the Palestinians, but also needs to be dominating in the region as a whole. That white military might separation, segregation, and discrimination, and has no actual legal legitimate roots for its being and existence, and depends mainly on military deterrence for its existence. Since its establishment, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, stressed that the quality military superiority of Israel was the only guarantee for the persistence, existence, and expansion of Israel, and that's why the nuclear arsenal has become the kind of our insurance bill for the Zionist project. The second point is that what are the existential threats to this entity? Of course, there are many threats, three of which are very important and which make it want and need to have this deterrence. The first is demographic threat. With the Palestinians between the river and the sea continuing to be of larger number, 7.2 million versus 7.1 Jews, which means that it is a demographic fact to be established on the long run. It's going to be difficult for this entity to persist with this demographic composition. That's why it must use the methods it is using today. As we see in the genocide it is launching on Gaza, which it used as an opportunity to deter and work on this threat, demographic bomb, to have this superiority and finish this conflict, even if it must use the heavy military methods, even if they were unacceptable for the world, as we can see in Gaza. So the nuclear deterrence helps it to continue with those policies because it deters other states from intervening. The third point of existential threats, which is conventional war. That is that it would fear only if Egypt is part of this war. So that's why it embarked on isolating Egypt from prospects of war. Any traditional and conventional war without Egypt would not be a problem. But should Egypt return to being a hot front or an adversary to the use of nuclear weapons as a matter of last resort, or at least the prospect. Of course, it could have used it in 1973 with the Syrian Egyptian military, but with the American intervention, it didn't. The other existential threat is the presence of weapons of mass destruction with other regional powers such as Iran. So since 1979, with the Islamic Republic in Iran, it became a threat to the Israeli entity, that because it doesn't recognize it and helps the resistance greatly. So the nuclear arsenal became also a last resort against that type of threat. The other point in relation to the Israeli military doctrine, the Israeli military doctrine, as Ben-Gurion defined, is related to early warning, active deterrence, and a quick resolve. In my opinion, they have become even 6 pillars of that doctrine, including the preemptive attacks and onslaughts, as we've seen more than once in the history of the Israeli enemy, except for the flood of Al-Aqsa, as they, for example, preemptively struck the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the 80s, and also the advance and superiority in intelligence, and also the other point is related to active deterrence through convincing the adversaries that any onslaught on the Zionists is absurd because they have the kind of force that would be completely deterring and able to resolve the conflict. And that's what we see in the reaction of Arab states who are deterred and afraid of engaging against these since the 1960s. They have lost any will or readiness to engage against the Zionists. The fourth point is to have a strong defense. But we have seen all of these defenses and the military doctrines fell in front of the Aqsa flood. And the other part of the military doctrine is the quick resolve, as they resolve the military engagements very quickly. In other words, they try to resolve before or swiftly before international powers intervene. And the other point is relations dominance by escalating the power to resolve conflicts. And that's where nuclear power becomes important, because it is the maximum they can, or the again, a matter of last resort. And the historical evolution of that nuclear process is in the 1952, shortly after the establishment of Israel, with the constitutional headed by Shimon Peres, who by a decision from Ben Gurion, with the support, French support, to start the new Israeli nuclear program and have the Daimuna in a Naqab desert. At the beginning, there were many American pressure, much American pressure by Eisenhower in the 60s and others. And there was a funny story actually at the time, saying that they wanted to stop the nuclear program by offering them instead some defensive weapons. It was only when Kennedy started giving them those defensive weapons to convince them to dismantle their nuclear program that the U.S. started to arm Israel, but they were in denial. They said they didn't have any nuclear program, and they sent them, but Kennedy sent them a letter giving a deadline to acknowledge the presence of a nuclear program, and saying that if you don't answer in the affirmative our questions, we will consider this an affirmative answer, and that you do have this nuclear program. His decision until the end of November at the time, and many people assume that the assassination of Kennedy was very much related to this issue based on recently disclosed documents. This is in the 60s and 50s, but in the 70s, between Nixon and Golda Meir, there was an understanding that there would be some sort of agreement on having a nuclear program, provided that they don't have any experiments or tests using what they called at the time strategic ambiguity. But then one Jewish person working in that program disclosed that they had 100 to 200 nuclear hits, and he was imprisoned because of that statement. But then in the 90s, they started working on how to actually operate those plants using air power or other things. So finally, the other point is that they were working on dominating their adversaries, making sure that their regional peers do not have any nuclear power. That's why they struck the Iraqi, the Syrian nuclear reactors, and they tried also to strike the Pakistani nuclear reactor, in addition to the many strikes against the Iranian nuclear program with the cyber attacks, the assassination of Iranian scientists, and and from having nuclear weapons. The other strategy was to use the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Egypt signed, was one of the very earliest signatory states on that treaty in 1960, and it went into force in 1971 for 25 years, and after the expiry of 5 years, the Americans wanted this treaty to be ongoing, but Egypt didn't agree and didn't agree on the renewal of that agreement before getting some promises that Israel would sign that treaty and become part of the non-proliferation program, and some new items were added to the non-proliferation agreement or treaty in 1995 with a protocol adopted at the time by the US, the UK, and Russia to put pressure on Israel in order to perpetuate the status quo. So the United States gave some ambiguous reassurance, but did very little by way of really ensuring that it stops the Israeli monopoly of nuclear weapons. The seventh point, and I'm trying to abide with the time you gave me, is that many look at the monopoly of active weapon is no longer acceptable. Every method that is unthinkable and unacceptable has been used by Israel. So what would stop it from actually using the nuclear weapons? So this can no longer be ignored as a prospect or a potential option for Israel. It is an entity that stops at nothing to fulfill its objectives unless it is deterred or stopped. So this nuclear arsenal that amounts to 200 to 300 nuclear heads that can be delivered by land, air, or sea, it can no longer be ignored, which means that in order to address this issue, there must be some options. I have written a paper on how to deal with the issue of the Zionist entity, and I conclude that the only solution is to dismantle the structures that are supremacist and discriminatory. But in order to dismantle them, we need to understand them properly and understand the different dimensions, including the nuclear arsenal. There are three options, at least. First is to develop nuclear weapons for regional powers. So we must not be a cheer for the failure of Iran to get a nuclear weapon, a bomb, but because if the Israelis have one, it is the right of every regional collective pressure for Pakistan to provide a nuclear umbrella, so to speak, through an agreement explicitly saying that should Israel use the nuclear weapons against any country in the region, that would be considered an attack against Pakistan. That's not easy to effect, because because many Pakistani elites look at this weapon as a strategic arsenal to be used against India. So we must activate the ummah, the sense of ummah to help activate this. Finally, the last option would be the actual development of other forms of weapons of mass destruction. I don't call for them, but the options are very difficult unless the Israel or the Zionist entity is stripped of those powers and weapons of mass destruction and nuclear arsenal. Very quickly, the 8th point is related to nuclear capabilities. Not only as a deterrent, it is used as a second blow or strike. So even if they don't use them in the first attack, they might use them in the second blow, especially using the marine dolphins or the submarines, Israeli submarines known as dolphins, which can operate outside the Middle East in the Indian Ocean or elsewhere, and their main objective is to monitor the situation and potentially can use cruise missiles to that is important for deterrence and menace. The other point is related to the U.S. Role as the state that provides the cover-up, not only in terms of financing all those military programs, including the Air Force, modern arsenal and weaponry, and maintaining Israeli military superiority, and diplomatic backup and protection in the Security Council and intelligence. The 9th point is the moral ethical dimension. This is very important. For example, in Iran, there is a fatwa that the nuclear weapon cannot be actually used or developed because it is destructive and cannot be, and is indiscriminatory, and this is to be respected and understood. But also, one must look at all the actual threats in the region. So, although there is some ambiguity about the Zionist attitude towards the use of nuclear weapons, but they also are clear in their rhetoric in the potentially using them. The final point is that it constitutes a threat to regional security, and this is something to be addressed by regional pressure to dismantle the Israeli nuclear arsenal. Although there is very little hope that this is going to work, because for a last resort that would protect them when things come down to an actual existential threat to this state through the Palestinian resistance, conventional war, or any other threat. In this case, they would resort to nuclear weapons. And the final thing is about the balance of terror, which they would like to maintain, and the mutual or deterrence and between, for example, the USSR and the US at the time of the Cold War. So today, the Muslim and Arab elites must consider what could or must be done in order to ensure that these terrifying weapons are not used in the conflict with the Zionists. Thank you so much. In terms of Pakistan, of course, it has a neighbor, an aggressor that occupies some territory, Muslim territory. So should there not be any nuclear weapons with Pakistan, they would stop at nothing. So it has acted as a deterrence, but it can be used not only as a deterrence to India, but also to the Zionist entity. But this requires a lot of hard work within the Pakistani community because the military and political elite in Pakistan are not convinced. They believe that they would be allowed to have the nuclear weapons uh, with two conditions: people and how it can be stored, etc. And the second point is that it only be used or as a deterrence against India, not any other regional power. And that's related to the Arab Zionist conflict. So we need some work within the Pakistani community. I talked with many military people from Pakistan and academicians, and they are surprised that I mentioned this because they don't see Israel as a threat as we see it. But now, after they've seen what is happening in Gaza, I believe they must have been convinced that this Israeli enemy is an enemy for all Muslim countries. It now depends on its capabilities, and it would stop at nothing if it sees any Muslim power gaining any military might. So in other words, the nuclear weapons in Pakistan might be targeted by the Israelis, and this prospect cannot be disregarded after we have seen what we have and that they must learn that they should not only look at the intentions, but also the capabilities. We've seen what happened in Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. Although they had very little power, Israel felt threatened and tried to eliminate that power. The same applies to Turkey, Pakistan, and any other Muslim nation.